Welcome back. We'll start the last session of Symposium. In this session, we'll discuss about U.S.-China relations in the COVID-19 era with three experts. In this session, Professor In-hui Park will in charge of moderator and discussant. He is a professor of the Division of International Studies at Ewha Women's University in Korea. He has been a member of Anniversary Committee. Advisory Committee has been a member of Advisory Committee. Please welcome Professor In-hui Park.
Thank you for the kind introduction. I am In-hui Park, teaching at Ewha Women's University. This is the third session organized by the University of Edinburgh 윤보선 Memorial Symposium. Based on the previous meaningful achievement of the two sessions, let's continue the interesting and also a very productive academic discussion in the third session on the title of the U.S.-China relations in the COVID-19. We have two speakers, well-known, remarkable speakers, one in UK and the other professor from South Korea. As we all understand, U.S.-China relation is one of the most significant and critical sessions in international relations, not only in the diplomatic area, but also economic and business and social area as well. So to understand what is the two countries' future relation after the corona is one of the the key question. Not only the people in Korea, but also people in UK and international society as well. Let me first introduce Dr. Oliver Turner. Dr. Oliver Turner from University of Edinburgh. He finished his degree in the University of Manchester in that area, international relations, and he touched a lot of issues regarding Asian works and UK diplomatic relations to China and the US and Asian countries as well. So we kindly invite Dr. Oliver Turner for the first speaker. Can you hear me, Dr. Turner?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Okay, please, floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you, Professor Park, for the kind introduction, and thanks to everyone for the invitation to participate in the symposium. It's going really well. Really pleased to see that, and welcome from Edinburgh, where, of course, COP26 is happening. I'm not in Glasgow, of course. I'm in Edinburgh, but it's happening very close by. So the eyes of the world are on Scotland, which is always nice to see. I'm going to share my screen so I can give my presentation. Can I ask if everyone can see that?
Sure, we can clearly see your file on the screen.
Great. I'm just going to try to... Okay. So, yeah, so I'll be speaking about UK perspectives on US-China relations. And I think this is an important topic for a number of reasons. First of all, from a UK perspective, it's important, I think, to talk in a moment about the UK's understanding of this relationship, but also its presence in the region because of what's happening in the UK at the moment, especially since it left the European Union. The UK is going through an enormous amount of change domestically and also internationally. And so to sort of situate the UK's position in this relationship is a very important thing to understand, I think, as I'll talk about in the presentation, mostly because the UK's foreign policy priorities are now in Asia. Also, it's important, I think, to talk about because the US-China relationship is the most consequential bilateral relationship in the world. And I think it's important to understand how countries like the UK fit into it and what they see, what they make of that relationship and how they're impacted by that relationship. So similarly sized countries, should we say, like South Korea and like others in Europe and elsewhere, I think are affected by the relationship in very similar ways as is the UK. So I'll talk about a few things as I go along. I think it's important, if we're going to understand what the UK sees that relationship between the US and China to be, I think it's important, first of all, to understand what the recent historical relationship between the UK and China has been. So I'll talk very briefly about that. I'll also talk quickly about the relationship as I see it between the United States and China. I won't be focusing on COVID, but I can mention that as I go through, because I think there are sort of long-running trajectories in that relationship which have perhaps been exacerbated by COVID, but we're not necessarily seeing anything revolutionary in the last few years. And then I'll talk more specifically about UK perspectives on the US-China relationship, and in particular about the way that the UK is now pitching itself as global Britain, or reinventing itself as global Britain after its exit from the European Union. And then I'll just give a very quick summary at the end. So, so the UK and China over recent years, there's an awful, I think it's a cliche to say with any relationship that it's going through changes, or that things are rapidly developing. But perhaps the relationship between the UK and China is changing, or has changed over the last 10 years, perhaps more quickly than it has done for an awful long time. If we just kind of skip back a few years to after the financial crash of 2007-8, the UK did what many European countries did, which was pivot itself towards China in particular. And between 2008 and around 2016, we had a period of time where the UK was very determined to strengthen its relations with China, particularly in terms of trade and economics and finance and that sort of thing. So they established the UK-China Economic and Financial Dialogue. The UK joined the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in 2015. And around this time, we had what was advertised, or what was promoted by the UK government in particular, but also by the Chinese government, as a golden era of UK-China relations. Xi Jinping made a visit to Manchester, very high-profile visit. Lots of trade agreements were announced. And I think there was a real determination to strengthen that trading relationship to some extent, regardless of the politics. I think in hindsight, that looks just like a slightly naive approach. And what we found in particular around that time was frictions between the UK and the United States, primarily over China. So Washington complained of constant accommodation of China on the part of the UK. This reached a kind of pinnacle when the UK joined the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. The US wasn't happy about that at all, because they lobbied the UK to stay out of it, but the UK did anyway. And that was really representative of the priority that the UK placed on China, because it's very unusual for the UK to do something which the US doesn't want it to do historically. So the UK really surprised people by joining that and by ignoring effectively the United States. This was all part of the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office's wider network shift towards Asia. So the UK was embarking on this sort of pivot, what I've called before a partial pivot towards Asia. It doesn't have the resources to pivot in the way that the United States did towards Asia. But resources were moved from Europe to China in particular, but also India, Thailand, Myanmar, North and South Korea as well, plus others like Mongolia, Vietnam, and others. So the UK made a real effort to redirect its attentions towards Asia, especially for the purposes of trade. This, I think, is a good illustration of what was happening at the time. It shows the cumulative value of Chinese foreign direct investment transactions across the EU from China. So Chinese investment into Europe between 2000 and 2019. And you can see that the UK is really way ahead of second place Germany, which is sort of attracted less than half of that amount. So you can see there are sort of concentrations of investment, of Chinese investment in Europe, in places like Germany, France, and Italy, but overwhelmingly in the UK. So we often have we have discussions sometimes in Europe about, there's a sort of fear that China is trying to buy Eastern Europe in particular through initiatives like the 16+1 initiative, where China is increasingly targeting Eastern Europe for investment. But you can see that the statistics really show that the UK was, and I use that term deliberately, was the primary sort of focus. From about 2016, things changed when Theresa May came into power. She immediately raised doubts about allowing Chinese investment into a nuclear power plant. which the Chinese government didn't like very much. It was the first sign of real resistance from the UK towards further Chinese investment in particular, but also other sort of activities in the UK economy. From about 2016 onwards, we have seen increasing skepticism, hostility, especially towards China. We see this domestically in our domestic politics. And we've seen a real diversification of regional partnerships. So the UK is now more determined to strengthen its relations with countries like Japan, with South Korea. The UK and South Korea in 2014 established a ministerial security dialogue, which happens every year, I believe. The UK in 2019 established a permanent mission to ASEAN. So the UK has kind of seen itself now, or has pitched itself more towards a sort of broader Asia approach, without concentrating as much on China. It's no coincidence that Brexit, the Brexit referendum happened in the same year. This is partly because, as I'll talk a little bit more about later on, there's been a desire now, there is a desire now in the UK to push for trade and closer relationships with the US in particular, but also Japan, Australia, India, and all these places, of course, have tensions with China. So there's been a kind of readjustment since 2016 in that relationship. And the idea of a golden era is now pretty much completely absent from political discourse. We never really hear about that anymore. And also its ambitions were never actually materialized. So the idea of, I think that the target was to double trade with China. The UK didn't manage that. And so this kind of golden era is, let's say, well and truly behind us now, should we say. Also important to talk, I think, about the US and China as well. When we think about how the UK sees this relationship. So as most of you, I'm sure, are very aware, between 2009 and 2017, the Obama approach was one of, I guess, what I would call cautious engagement. The US at the time said it welcomes the rise of China, but with expressed differences. So there are always caveats to that. The language was always very diplomatic, although it's always been said, you know, in the United States that the US and China are fundamentally different places. But with Obama, the line was that they could work together. Tensions emerged in the latter years of the Obama administration. But from 2017 to the present, under Trump and Biden, we've seen a much more overtly hostile, confrontational approach towards Beijing. I think Donald Trump sort of quite successfully tapped into domestic public opinion about China, which has always been relatively skeptical of China. I think Biden has continued that. He's not reverting to a sort of Obama-era approach of softer diplomatic language. I think he sees himself as somewhat trapped by American public opinion towards China, especially in the COVID era, when attitudes towards China have further deteriorated in the United States. So the US national security strategy under Trump in 2017 labeled China a strategic competitor, revisionist, and expansionist. This is all an escalation of rhetoric from the Obama era. The notion of decoupling the two economies is now debated. It's extremely difficult to do that, of course, because the economic connections between the US and China are incredibly deep and complex in all kinds of ways. But of course, this is now the language of making the US less reliant on Chinese investment and Chinese trade. And one quote which I think really stands out from the last few years, I think it's a really important one, that the FBI director, Christopher Wray, said at the time in 2018, China is not just a whole of government threat, but a whole of society threat. And I think it's going to take a whole of society response by us. So I'm generally skeptical about the idea that we're entering a new Cold War. This is talked about a lot. I think it can simplify the relationship between the US and China somewhat. So I'm not a big fan of that term, but I do think that Cold War language is certainly coming back. And this idea of China being a whole of society threat and that it takes a whole of society approach by the US sort of suggests that it's American citizens' responsibilities to be on the lookout for the Chinese threat. At least that's the implication, that's the suggestion. And this, of course, is very Cold War thinking. So I think we are sort of creeping back into the Cold War language. And the UK, of course, can't completely separate itself from that. There are very deeply ingrained societal US suspicions of China. So this is nothing necessarily new. This is what I mentioned before, that I don't think COVID has necessarily revolutionized the US-China relationship or changed it into something that was unrecognizable before. There's always been very low favorability of China in the US. Favorability ratings actually never recovered after Tiananmen Square in 1989. So China has been sort of paying the price for that for a very long time. And the idea of a Red Scare from China is very easy to reignite. We saw this in a campaign, presidential campaign advert by Joe Biden that he was criticized for sort of targeting China and the Chinese as using kind of red imagery to denote communism. And sort of passing that off to Chinese people as well. And in China, as elsewhere, of course, on the other side, US aggression is a very useful political tool. And the fact that the US has maintained regional bases around China for a very long time provide helpful evidence for the Chinese Communist Party to fuel the tensions that are going on between them. So again, nothing new, I don't think necessarily since COVID. I think the language on both sides in the US and in China has become more aggressive in recent years. And we're seeing a real escalation of those tensions, again, that the UK can't fully remove itself from. I'll move on to that in a second. So I think that the US-China relationship is effectively primed for tension and hostility, not because of sudden events or developments like COVID or like Trump. I think they certainly change things when they come along. But I think if you look back really for hundreds of years, you see very historically ingrained images and representations, especially in American society, about what China is. The idea of a China threat is always very close to the surface in US society. It's very easy to reignite when it's politically useful, and I think that's what's happening at the moment. So I don't think it's just a matter of great power politics. I don't think the UK is being caught up in simply great power politics between the US and China. That's part of it. But I think there's a much longer story here about cultural views of one another, both in China and the United States. They have a long history of viewing each other in very particular ways, and these are, as I say, very easy to sort of reignite useful times. So where does global Britain fit into all this? Maybe the first question to ask is, what is global Britain? Global Britain, I feel like I'm never really sure how well this phrase travels, this slogan travels. The UK has tried to reinvent itself since Brexit as global Britain. I think this slogan is directed domestically as much as it is for international partners. I think it's a way to justify Brexit, to try to promote the advantages of Brexit, of leaving the European Union. This idea that the UK is now a global force rather than just a European force. I think this is really with domestic voters in mind, although it is also being promoted internationally to try to persuade international partners as well. This, I think, is seen as an important thing, mostly because most of the UK's international partners disagreed with the idea of Brexit. Most sort of partners came out before the referendum and said that it would probably be in the UK's best interests if it stayed in the European Union, and that it would be in those partners' interests as well. Japan, of course, was the most vocal about this and really didn't like the idea of Brexit at all. But I think this is partly about justifying Brexit domestically and internationally, and promoting the UK as a global force rather than just a European one. So post-Brexit, the UK is trying to affirm a new identity. It's trying to reinvent itself. I think it's been forced to reinvent itself. I think there is some confusion in parts of the world about what the UK is now. If it isn't a European power, then what is it? Is it a global power? Is it a great power? Is it a middle power? What is the UK? And I think this is the UK trying to present a narrative of itself, to try to allow others to make sense of it. How successful that'll be, I suppose that's for others to judge, and time will tell. But we've had a few sort of policy documents which outline this idea of global Britain. So I think what the UK did after Brexit in particular was it had to make calculations about global developments. It had to look around and effectively see which way the wind was blowing, especially in terms of US-China relations. It happened, of course, at a moment just before Donald Trump was about to be elected. And the Republican candidates across the board to be the next president were very vocal on the China threat. So it was clear even before Trump was elected that US-China relations were on a trajectory of probably increasing tensions. It was evident in the Obama administration, but Biden and Clinton on the Democrat side and the Republicans as well were all very clear, really, about how they saw the relationship with China, that the US needed to sort of stand up to China more. And so I think the UK made some calculations that this was happening, that there are tensions and intensifying narratives of in particular, a free and open world versus authoritarian societies. It was clear which way the wind was blowing, and I think the UK needed to align itself with one side or the other. That's simplifying things. There aren't just two sides, of course, and we're not in a sort of Cold War situation, but I think these are the types of calculations that were going on in the UK at the time. So now what we have is the notion of a rules-based international order, which is central to British political narratives and foreign policy. It's discussed a lot here, as I know it is elsewhere and in Asia as well. This need to defend the rules-based international order, whatever that might be, from threats, notably places like China and Russia and others. And what we're seeing is a real alignment between global Britain, or the UK, and the United States and its allies. We're seeing a sort of coming together of a number of allies around these types of themes. And this is, I think, the way that the post-Brexit UK has sort of made its calculations. We see this in various ways. So the UK recently sent its new aircraft carrier through the South China Sea. It was doing various maneuvers with partners in the Indo-Pacific. So the UK is clearly very keen to strategically, militarily align itself with what it calls like-minded partners. Perhaps a very telling example of this is AUKUS recently, this new agreement between the UK, Australia and the United States. There's also the Five Eyes Alliance. The UK makes a lot of these things at the moment because it is seeing how this relationship between the US and China is going, and it's decided to align itself much more strongly with the United States and others. And we see this very clearly in the UK's new strategy document, which was published in 2021. It's the most significant one for a number of years, and it was published again in the aftermath of Brexit to kind of clarify what the UK, tried to clarify what the UK is in the world. And a very telling quote in that is, "We will sit at the heart of a network of like-minded countries and flexible groupings. Our influence will be amplified by stronger alliances and wider partnerships, none more valuable to British citizens than our relationship with the United States." So a very clear statement that the UK is aligning itself more with the United States. I think there's a view that the golden era with China was not necessarily a mistake, but perhaps slightly naive. This idea that it could keep its trading relationship with China separate from the politics of its relations with others, like the United States. That idea is now behind it in political discourse in the UK. We don't really consider it that way anymore. The document follows on. "The United States will remain our most important bilateral relationship, essential to key alliances and groups such as NATO and the Five Eyes, and our largest bilateral trading partner and inward investor." So very clear statements about how important the United States is to the UK. This is from Global Britain in a Competitive Age, the UK's integrated review. For anyone interested in what UK foreign policy is right now, or what it is intended to be, that's the document to read. And in some ways, this is sort of counterintuitive, or at least there are some contradictions to this document, mostly because the UK's priority now, foreign policy priority, is the Indo-Pacific. So this document is very heavily references the Indo-Pacific, more than any other place in the world. So the UK is clearly very keen to become more integrated into the region, of course, establishing new trading relationships with Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. It's applied to become a member of the CPTPP and so on. So the Indo-Pacific is its focus, but it is also in some ways pulling back from its relationship with China, with the most significant, with the most powerful actor in that region. So the UK is having to tread a fairly careful line in the region, in the sense of becoming more integrated there, but keeping China at something more of an arm's length, certainly compared to it did before. So what we see in this idea of global Britain is a shift really towards networks and alliances over most bilateral relationships. So whereas before we had this idea of a closer relationship with China, which you could have almost in isolation from everything else, now we're seeing a shift towards the importance of networks and alliances like the ones I mentioned, AUKUS, the Five Eyes, and so on. And this is now more the focus of British foreign policy, and it's how it's approaching the relationship between the US and China. I think it realizes that it can't really stand up to China in a way that it would ideally like, and so it's falling back on traditional alliances, especially the ones led by the United States. Because of course, these networks and alliances that the UK is now very keen to embed itself within increasingly see China as a problem or a threat. All the ones that it's getting more involved with, including NATO, that it's been a part of for a long time, of course. So these often US-led networks are very heavily framed by perceptions of ideology, this idea of free and open societies, democracy versus non-democracy, excuse me. But also, I think, quite problematically in some ways, and this is something which is discussed less at the moment, I think, in terms of imperialist notions of civilization. And in particular, what I have in mind there is the Anglosphere, to some degree the Commonwealth, which is, of course, a throwback to the British Empire. But the Anglosphere is something of a problematic concept, of course, because it's a Caucasian view of the world, almost a white supremacist view of the world, certainly one of the British Empire, where the UK has close ties with the United States, with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and AUKUS is a very good example of that the UK has damaged its relationship with France in order to join an English-speaking grouping of the United States and Australia. So the UK, this strategy document of the UK's carries on, will continue to pursue a positive trade and investment relationship with China while ensuring our national security and values are protected. We will also cooperate with China in tackling transnational challenges such as climate change. So there's an effort to work with China, and there's always, the UK isn't willing to jettison its relationship with China. It's being very careful about how it deals with China. But there is always a caveat, very much in line with US discourse, or at least more in line with US discourse, that China is in some ways a problem and a challenge. And in fact, it says that China is a systemic competitor, which matches the US language. The significant impact of China's military modernization and growing international assertiveness within the Indo-Pacific region and beyond will pose an increasing risk to UK interests. So there's some quite strong language in there as well about the risk that China poses. And this, I would say, is mostly for an American audience. It's written for Washington in some ways, perhaps some way to repair the tensions of 5 years ago or so, and to persuade the United States that actually the UK isn't simply a lapdog, so to speak, of China, which is one of the criticisms that I mentioned before that came from Washington. So just to wrap up quickly, the UK-China golden era, so-called golden era, didn't really last very long. I would say it failed to materialize really because its economic goals were never realized. And the relationship between the UK and China, I think, was always less politically stable than some people described, and I think than some people hoped. Even during the years when David Cameron was in charge here, there were tensions. For example, when he met the Dalai Lama. So there have been sort of tensions along the way, and the golden era ended fairly abruptly, if we are even to consider it a thing. I'm skeptical. I think it was just a sort of promotional campaign. But Brexit has left the UK in a pretty unfamiliar and uncertain territory. I think to some degree the UK doesn't entirely know what it is anymore, and it's seeking a new identity and new international foundations to be able to persuade others what it is. I think it does recognize the challenge of convincing others like South Korea, like Japan and the United States. It has to convince them of what it has now, that it didn't have when it was a member of the EU. And that's a challenge. You know, how can the UK explain that it's in a better position now to help in terms of global security, in terms of development and those kinds of things outside of the European Union? That is a challenge, but it's what the UK is having to do now. And I think what it's doing is what the UK is doing now is rediscovering these foundations in its most familiar partnerships, especially with the United States, and even perhaps ironically with Europe. The UK is still cooperating when it has to with members of the European Union. Relationships are very strained, but perhaps ironically, the UK, I think, is finding itself still reliant on European members. Other networks like the Commonwealth and other US allies, these are also very familiar, and it's those that it's falling back on more so than any others. So the nature of US-China relations very strongly shape UK-China relations. With some room for maneuver for the UK, it is able to do to some extent what it wants, but it is very heavily constrained by political pressures, both domestically that we have with this increasing skepticism towards China domestically, and also abroad where partners like the United States are very keen for the UK to fall in line, as it were, and to act in accordance with its allies like Australia and India and Japan and so on. And I think to some extent that is what we're seeing. So thank you. Thanks for listening. I will happily take any comments or questions at the end.
Thank you, Oliver Turner. This is very interesting and well organized and concise presentation, and to appreciate sharing your ideas and views regarding UK's perspective for UK-China relations. And I personally learned a lot regarding the history of the UK-China relations, and also UK's perspective regarding the two countries' competitiveness, competition, and also what is the meaning and discussion about global Britain. Okay.